We're entering a time in American Indian history where there is a lot to distill because of the relationships that are being built with different nations during this time. So this presentation is an attempt to distill what's transpiring in Indian country, as well as what happened as a result of several major transitions in American Indian history during this time for Indian nations. So during this time period that we're looking at in American Indian history, some really seminal things happen in Indian history. So those things happen as a result of the interactions that Indian people have with the French, the British, and eventually with the Spanish. But right now we're going to focus on the relationships with the French and the British. So as we know in American history, American Indian history, there's a signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This comes after the 7 Years' War, which we know that the American Indians fought for either the French or the British in. However, in the signing of that treaty, it was only signed by the French and the British. So what happened as a result of the signing of that treaty is the French cede a large portion of land to the British, and the British are in effect in control of the land on the eastern border of America. So during that time period, it's a huge transition for what relationships might look like in Indian country, how relationships are going to be dealt with, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But what I want you now to focus on is the time period between the signing of the Treaty of Paris and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence marked America's basically telling the British that they were going to declare their independence from Britain and attempt to become their own country. So we see that that's a very short time period, and there's a lot of transition that happens between the Treaty of Paris, where the British have control over America and laws, and then that transition to Americans having control over a new set of laws and a new type of governance. So the conversation now is what happens during that transition to American Indian people, how do they participate in that, what does it look like, and what sort of choices are they able to make, and why did they make those choices during that time period. So one of the first things that happens after the signing of the Treaty of Paris is something called the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is put in place. If you look on the right, what you can see is the Royal Proclamation line is an invisible line that was drawn basically by the British colonies to tell settlers, hey, you can't settle west of this proclamation line. We need to be able to negotiate with Indian people in order to acquire any of that land. We don't want you negotiating with Indian people. We still want to make sure that we have that power, and we're going to negotiate with them on a nation-to-nation basis. Needless to say, as we know, prior to that time, Indian nations had a lot more freedom. They were not only able to negotiate with colonists, so not just simply the British government or one governmental entity, but they were all able to make their own choices and their own decisions. So they were able to trade with people who it made sense for them to trade with. They were able to negotiate with people, countries that it made sense to have them trade or negotiate with. They were able to make choices about what that trade might look like, trading hunting goods or different services at that time. So during the early colonial America, Indian nations were able to make a lot of choices based upon what worked for them and what sort of things that they wanted out of that trade. So as we know, in that early years of colonial America, Indian people adopted different practices. Some of them adopted different religious practices, different trade goods. Social structures changed during this time, but it was really a matter of Indian people making those choices. What we see after the signing of the Treaty of Paris is kind of a shift in what Indian people and the power that they have looks like. So once Britain gains control of the eastern portion of what we now know as the United States, Britain signs that proclamation trying to regulate this new frontier that they have hold of. They want to make sure that people aren't going onto Indian lands. They want to try to protect those lands, and they want to, moreover, provide a means to prevent any further Indian wars. So their way of doing that is just simply prohibiting settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, which is really part of that boundary line. Colonists, however, as we know, there's new immigration, there's new people coming in. Moreover, there are people who are currently in colonial America or colonial Britain during that time who have investments in Western lands and start to become pretty irritated at Britain during this time, believing that they have now investments that they can't sell because the British are telling them that they can't sell any lands west of the Proclamation line. So there's a feeling now that the British are trying to control them. Colonists, both elite as well as new immigrants, are not happy about being controlled and being told where they can settle and where they can't. Moreover, we have this kind of new scenario in place where Britain, because of this very expensive war that they just had with France, is now unable to give Indians gifts as they did in the past to establish diplomatic relationships. So that's one other big factor to consider is financial means are now no longer where they were prior to this pretty massively expensive war that went down between the French and the British. So if you set up kind of that scenario where you have this proclamation drawn, people are unhappy, colonists who are settled now in the eastern 13 colonies are unhappy that they can move west and claim their own land. You have this new kind of era emerge as a result of this new control with the British people. So what we see is treaties being made. However, treaties are still being made now without consultation of the king. For example, the Port Stanwix Treaty. It was a treaty signed in the colonies, but it wasn't given the authority of the king. And so what it did is people in the colonies made an agreement with the Iroquois, and they actually sold land that was Cherokee and Shawnee land. So we see things like this emerge because you have this governance clear off across the sea, not really capable of controlling what's happening in the 13 colonies. We also see the emergence of what is best characterized as Indian hating. We have people like the Paxton Boys starting to attack Indian villages for no reason other than they hate Indian villages because they're taking their land and they don't allow them to have the land that is rightfully theirs. We also see a new era of commanders. For example, Geoffrey Amherst, who is a commander of the British Army. He believes that there is no longer room for negotiation with Indian people under this new power of the British authority, and that the Indian people are supposed to be governed, not negotiated with. So not only do the British no longer have financial means to give gifts, they also come in with this new idea that it's not their duty any longer to negotiate with Indian tribes, rather to govern Indian tribes. So we see the emergence of trying to wipe out Indian people, trying to move them off their land, trying to negotiate with them on a local basis rather than through the governmental channels, because people are looking for land and trying to find ways to get that land. So what are Indian people's responses to the revolution? Well, as we saw in the documents for this week, there's a lot of different responses, and the responses are very localized and very much a response to what sort of issues they're facing as a result of their geography and their relationship to other people within the colonies as well as other tribes. So some tribes choose to remain neutral, as we saw with the Oneida in the documents. However, we do have a lot of tribes attempting to build alliances, either with the Americans, the British, or other tribes. There are also divisions within the tribes, as we saw in the documents that we read, the Cherokee document. We see divisions where the Six Nations actually divides. Some people remaining neutral, others wanting to ally with the Americans, and other people allying with the British. We also see divisions within tribes because of their religious affiliations. The Oneida were working with the missionary Kirkland, and they allied eventually with the Americans, whereas the Mohawk, also of the Iroquois Confederacy, eventually decides to ally with the British along with the Cherokee Nation. So what we see here is a map of what is the Longhouse of the Iroquois Six Nations. So what you can see is the Longhouse is symbolic of the different tribes and how they're laid out within the Longhouse. The Mohawk, they're along the eastern border of what we now know as the United States. And then coming in from that eastern border, we have the Oneida, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Cayuga, and then the Seneca, clear into the center. So what's relevant about this is they represent very strategic places for the British and the Americans to be able to ally with different tribes, as well as to win different lands that could be further west. Obviously, the Seneca hold a lot of power, being able to push west into that territory that the Americans ultimately want. So within the Iroquois, what breaks out is really a civil war. The British are able to recruit the Mohawks, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Seneca people to fight with them. In the Cherokee report from the Cherokee country, what we see is the Mohawks going down, allying themselves with the young Cherokee Nation, who had had lots of their land taken away at that time, saying, please fight with us at this time, fight with the British to get those colonists off our land. So the new migrants, the new people coming in to the United States at that time. We also see that there is a dissension among even the people that are within the Six Nations. So also within that report from Cherokee country, we see that the young and the old have different ideas about how to handle the war. Some people believing that they need to fight, other people believing that they need to remain neutral. So ultimately, the Americans are allied with the Oneida and the Tuscarora. Initially, the Oneida seek neutrality, but eventually they decide to side with the Americans and fight with the colonists. So as I mentioned previously, some tribes try to remain neutral. Initially, the Oneida tried to remain neutral, as did the Shawnee and Delaware. However, circumstances arise that change the decision of the tribes. Americans kill the chiefs, and ultimately both the Shawnee and the Delaware tribes decide to side with the British. So different things happen during the Revolutionary War that basically push the tribes to make choices about who they're going to fight for and what they think is going to be in their best interest. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, what we have is yet again a new diplomacy. It is the American diplomacy. So what we now want to think about is, what does that look like for American Indian people in that span between the Treaty of Paris and the Declaration of Independence and ultimately the end of the Revolutionary War. So diplomacy now looks like in the United States of America that it's a right of conquest to land, and that in this new government under the Constitution, they demand tribes to basically give away their land in order to have peace between Indian people and Americans. So what happens in the early years of this diplomacy is the Iroquois, and it's really just one Iroquois member, agrees to cede land. However, once he goes back to the council, he finds out that none of the other council members agree and refuse to ratify that tribe. So in effect, what you see is the beginning of something that will happen across the United States. One member of a tribe signing a treaty that basically gives away the land of the whole tribe without the consent of the rest of the land. So as a result of that, some people within the Iroquois Nation decide to stay. Other people at that point decide to flee to Canada. We also see a new diplomacy in terms of how they're going to interact with Indian nations. This happens at a fort. There's really no diplomacy happening. Prisoners are killed before the Shawnees' eyes, and this is how diplomacy is handled.